The Inferno and the Abyss. The scent of scorched metal and burnt insulation was a perfume to Jake. It was a familiar, grim aroma that had defined his life for 15 years. He wasn't a hero, not in the way the local news anchors with their slick hair and manufactured smiles made him out to be. He was a fireman, a firefighter, a man who ran toward what everyone else ran from. And for the past decade and a half, he had been damn good at it. He stood on the tarmac, the afternoon sun a brutal glare against the smoke-choked horizon. The Liberty Tower, a 50-story monument to corporate greed and glass, was a furnace. Flames licked the sky, turning the clouds a sickly orange-gray. The city, his city, was holding its breath, a choked gasp of sirens and distant screams. "Chief, we've got a report of an active fire on floors 35 and 36. A rookie, barely old enough to shave, shouted over the roar. "Internal collapse confirmed. We've got civilians trapped." Jake didn't need to be told. His gut was already twisted into a knot of cold dread. He looked at his crew, a brotherhood forged in shared sweat and danger. There was Mike, his best friend, a gentle giant with a quiet strength that made you feel safe just by standing near him. And there was Liam, the youngest of the bunch, fresh out of the academy, but with the heart of a lion. "Mike, you're with me. Liam, you and your team secure the south entrance and check for survivors on the lower levels," Jake commanded, his voice a steady rock in the chaos. They moved with practiced efficiency. The air inside the building was a choking haze of heat and acrid smoke. As they ascended, the temperature climbed, and the roar of the fire became a living, breathing thing. On the 35th floor, they found a corridor engulfed in flames. "Mike, get that hose line ready!" Jake yelled, his eyes scanning the inferno for any sign of life. Just as Mike unspooled the hose, a thunderous crash from above rattled the very foundation of the building. The ceiling gave way, sending a shower of burning debris raining down on them. Jake pushed Mike back, but he wasn't fast enough. A massive, flaming beam fell, pinning Mike to the ground. "Mike!" Jake screamed, dropping to his knee. Family. And he had failed. The next few days were a blur of grief and media scrutiny. The initial reports were sympathetic, but soon a new narrative began to emerge. The city council, under pressure from powerful business interests, needed a scapegoat. The investigation twisted and contorted the facts, blaming human error. The final report was a masterpiece of corporate deceit. It concluded that Jake, as lead officer, had failed to secure the perimeter, leading to Mike's death and contributing to the building's structural failure. His reputation, his career, his very identity, all of it was being methodically dismantled. At home, his wife Sarah watched the news reports with cold, disbelieving eyes. "Jake, the report says, they're saying it was your fault," she said, her voice hollow. "It's a lie, Sarah," he insisted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They're covering for someone. I did everything by the book." But the doubt had already taken root. The whispers from neighbors, the cold stares from other firefighters, they were slowly poisoning her mind. The trust they had built over a lifetime was crumbling. "They have evidence, Jake. Photos, transcripts," she said, clutching their daughter's hand. I don't know who you are anymore." That was the final blow. The words were a death knell to his soul. The man who had faced down countless fires and rescued countless lives couldn't save his own family. In the end, he wasn't a hero. He was just a man, betrayed and broken, standing at the edge of an abyss with nothing left to lose. And in that moment, he decided he would find out who was responsible, no matter the cost. His life as a fireman was over. His new life as a ghost had just begun. The glare of the television screen was a physical weight, pressing in on Jake. He sat on the worn couch, his hands clenched into fists, watching a slick-haired city official deliver the final verdict. The report from the City Fire and Rescue Investigation Division confirms that the fire at Liberty Tower was exacerbated by a failure to follow standard safety protocols. As a result, Fire Captain Jake Riley has been relieved of praise, now appeared on local news channels under headlines like "Firefighter's Fate, Tragedy or Knee?" His colleagues, the men he'd fought alongside, avoided his gaze. When he went to the firehouse to clear out his locker, the silence was deafening. The unspoken accusations hung in the air, thick as smoke. Mike's locker was still there, untouched. It was a monument to his failure, a constant, agonizing reminder. But the betrayal ran deeper than a city report or the cold shoulders of his peers. It came from the person he trusted most. Sarah, once his rock, now looked at him with a mix of pity and suspicion. Every conversation was an interrogation. "Jake, why would they lie? What did you do? Just tell me the truth." "I have told you the truth, Sarah," he would plead. "I did nothing wrong. It was a setup." But the media had done its job. The fabricated evidence, the doctored transcripts of his radio calls, the manipulated footage from the body cameras had created a narrative too powerful to ignore. The image of the hero firefighter was gone, replaced by the careless, reckless captain who would cost a man his life. One evening, he came home to a house steeped in silence. Sarah was packing a suitcase, not her own, but their daughter Lily's. "What are you doing?" he asked, his heart sinking. Her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain that mirrored his own. "I can't stay here, Jake. I can't live with this. Lily, she deserves a normal life. She can't go to school being the daughter of that." She pointed a trembling finger at the TV, where a news analyst was dissecting his character. "Sarah, please, don't do this," he begged, the words catching in his throat. "I have to," she said, her voice breaking. "I have to believe in something. I don't know what to believe in anymore, Jake, and until you can clear your name, I can't be here. It's too much." She didn't wait for a response. She took Lily's hand and walked out the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing in the empty house. The city. He wasn't just unemployed. He was unmade. His identity was gone. He was no longer a firefighter, a husband, or a father in the way he once was. He was a ghost haunting a life that had been violently ripped away. For weeks, he drifted. He slept on the couch, ate cold leftovers, and stared at the framed photos on the wall. Pictures of a smiling family, a life that felt like a stranger's memory. The city news, still buzzing with his disgrace, was a constant torment. Every report was another nail in his coffin. He would leave the apartment, take the bus to the other side of town, and just walk. He walked until his feet ached, until the city's concrete canyons felt less like a cage and more like a maze he was determined to solve. It was during one of these aimless wanderings that a flicker of an idea took root. He found himself standing in front of the public library, a place he hadn't stepped inside since he was a kid. He felt a pull, a strange sense of purpose. Inside, he wasn't Jake Riley, the disgraced fire captain. He was just a man with a library card. He spent hours there, poring over old newspaper archives, fire safety regulations, and building codes. He was searching for the truth. He had no one to help him, no one to trust. He was an investigator now, and his first case was his own. He started small. The official fire report from his case was public record. He requested it. Then he compared it to the building's original blueprints. He had worked on that very building before the fire, had walked every floor during inspections. He knew the layout of Liberty Tower better than the back of his hand. He began to see the discrepancies. The report said the fire originated on the 35th floor, but the blueprints showed a complex network of utility lines and a maintenance closet that was not mentioned in the report. A closet that should have contained fire suppression equipment. He drew circles and arrows, connecting lines, mapping out a conspiracy. His next step was a visit to the local zoning and building permits office. He dressed in a cheap suit he hadn't worn in years, trying to look like a small-time cop. Go to the police. They were complicit. The media was a lost cause. He had to go it alone. He wasn't a hero anymore, and he wasn't a victim. He was a man with a purpose, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than any fire he'd ever fought. And as he walked out of the office and into the bustling city street, he knew his long, quiet war had just begun. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a hunter, the vanishing witness and the first thread. Jake's investigation had become his entire existence. The library was his office, the internet cafe his command center, and the streets of the city were his hunting grounds. He was a creature of the night, a shadow lurking in the corners of a world that no longer saw him. He'd found the first thread in the massive tangled web of lies, the blueprints and the suspiciously timed renovation permits. Now he had to follow it. The public fire report, the very document that had ruined his life, had a list of official witnesses. Most were other firefighters and city officials, all of whom had already turned on him. But one name stood out. A low-level building inspector named Frank Miller. According to the report, Miller had been the last person to sign off on the Liberty Tower's fire safety inspection just 2 days before the blaze. His statement was a single cryptic sentence. "All fire safety measures were in place, to my knowledge." That phrase, "to my knowledge," was what caught Jake's attention. It wasn't a firm confirmation, it was a subtle signal of doubt, a tiny crack in the official narrative. Jake felt it in his gut. Frank Miller was the one person who might have seen what was really happening. He was the one who could confirm the rigged renovation. He was the first piece of his puzzle. Jake started his search for Miller. He went to the last known address listed for him in the city's public records, a small, unassuming house in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of town. He drove his beat-up old truck there, parking a block away to avoid suspicion. He sat there for hours, watching the house, but no one came or went. The scary-looking man was at his house. Big guy in a black car. He didn't look like family. A chill ran down Jake's spine. Scary-looking man in a black car. This wasn't a sudden trip. This was a forced disappearance. Someone had gotten to Miller before he could talk. Jake thanked the woman and returned to his truck, his mind racing. He was on the right track, but the people he was hunting were a step ahead. They knew what he was looking for, or at least they knew Frank Miller was a liability. He had to assume they were watching him now, too. The game was no longer just about finding the truth. It was about survival. He didn't give up on Miller. He dug deeper, cross-referencing public databases, old social media profiles, and any scraps of information he could find. He discovered that Miller's wife, a woman named Carol, had posted a cryptic message on a local gardening forum a few weeks after her husband's disappearance. "My garden is dying. I've lost all my roots. I don't know where to plant new ones." The message was a quiet cry for help, a signal to anyone who might be listening. Jake knew what he had to do. Frank Miller was gone, but his family might still be in danger. He had to find Carol. She was the only person who could lead him to her husband and the truth. His investigation had just taken a far more dangerous turn. He wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was a protector, fighting for the truth and for the innocent people caught in the crossfire. Jake's hunt for Carol Miller led him back to the very system that had betrayed him. He knew the police force's internal workings better than anyone. It was a tangled web of favors, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. He needed a back door, a way to access information without triggering alarms. His mind immediately went to a man he had once considered a brother, Detective Mark Collins. Mark was a cop's cop, loyal, by the book, and fiercely dedicated. He and Jake had been inseparable in their youth, two kids from the same rough neighborhood who had found purpose in public service. They'd been in each other's weddings. Mark had even been at the hospital when Lily was born. The bond was supposed to be unbreakable.
Get straight to the point. I need your help, Mark. It wasn't my fault. I'm being framed. Mark took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes avoiding Jake's. The report was pretty clear, Jake. The evidence, it was airtight. It was fabricated, Jake countered, his voice low and urgent. They doctored the radio logs, Mark. You know me. I've been in more fires than I can count. I would never have made a call like that. The brass says you were under stress, that you made a mistake, Mark said, his tone clipped. He was reciting lines from a script he'd been given. Jake leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. They needed a scapegoat. A construction company and some rich investors needed that building to burn. They rigged the place, Mark. They set it up. Mark finally looked at him, and for the first time, Jake saw a hint of the inner conflict. He wanted to believe him. The Mark he knew would have been all over this, fighting for a friend, but this Mark was different. He was bound by something else, loyalty to the force, maybe, or a promise he'd made to someone higher up. Look, Jake, I'm sorry about what happened, Mark said, his voice softening just a little. But you've got to let this go. You're stirring up trouble. There are powerful people involved here. You could get hurt. Powerful people are the ones who got my friend killed, Jake shot back. And they made me look like a damn murderer. I'm not letting it go. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It was the cryptic message from Carol Miller. I'm looking for a woman named Carol Miller. Her husband was a building inspector on the Liberty Tower. He vanished right after the fire. I think he saw something. I think they made him disappear. Mark took the paper and glanced at it, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He quickly folded it and slid it into his pocket. He then looked at Jake with a cold finality. Don't come to me with this stuff, Jake. This isn't my case, and you're not my partner anymore. I'm telling you this for your own good. Drop it. With that, Mark stood up, tossed a few bills on the table at the county clerk's office, losing himself in the dusty bureaucratic records. He traced Phoenix Holdings' ownership back through a labyrinth of shell corporations and blind trusts. It was a classic corporate smokescreen designed to protect the identities of the real players. But Jake was stubborn. He'd learned to be patient, to wait for a fire to reveal its source. He applied that same discipline here. He finally hit a break. A tiny footnote on a property deed from 5 years prior mentioned a DM Enterprises. He cross-referenced the name and found the sole proprietor, Dennis "Denny" Malone, a notorious real estate developer. Malone was a shark, known for buying up rundown properties, accidentally having them burned down, and then rebuilding them as high-end condos. He was exactly the kind of man who would profit from a fire like the one at Liberty Tower. But Malone was just a foot soldier. The real money, the real power, had to come from somewhere else. Jake went back to the old zoning and permit records, this time focusing on the approvals. He saw the same signature on every single document that had expedited Malone's permits. Councilman Walter Hayes. Hayes was a pillar of the community, a well-dressed politician with a booming laugh and a reputation for being a man of the people. He was often on the news, giving speeches about urban renewal and economic growth, but Jake now saw him for what he was, the architect of this conspiracy. Malone was the builder, but Hayes was the one who had cleared the path, greased the wheels, and buried the evidence. The politician, a man sworn to serve his city, was the one who had lit the match. The pieces were now falling into place, forming a clear, horrifying picture. Malone and Hayes had conspired to burn down Liberty Tower, likely to collect a massive insurance payout and then rebuild for an even bigger profit. And Jake, the fire captain who was supposed to save lives, was nothing more than a convenient fall guy. A man whose ruined reputation was a small price to pay for their success. Jake knew he couldn't confront them directly. A disgraced fireman walking into Malone's penthouse or Hayes' office would be dismissed as a lunatic. He had no proof, just theories and a few suspicious documents. He had to go deeper, to find the physical evidence that would link them to the dangerous food chain, and Jake was a predator now, working his way up, one quiet, calculated step at a time. The web was becoming clearer, and he knew he had to pull the right thread to make the whole thing unravel. The unmasking and the painful truth. Jake's silent hunt continued, his focus narrowing on Malone and Hayes. He became an expert in their habits. He knew Malone's favorite coffee shop, the route his driver took, and the time he typically left his office. He also knew Hayes' schedule, the charities he supported, and the political rivals he secretly undermined. Jake was no longer a firefighter. He was an intelligence operative, and his targets were the two men who had destroyed his life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake was staking out Malone's office building one rainy evening when he saw a familiar figure step out of a black town car. It was his old friend, Mark Collins. The detective, the man who had told him to drop it, was walking into Malone's private penthouse suite. Jake's blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. This was confirmation. He waited for hours, soaked to the bone, watching the windows of Malone's penthouse. He saw two figures silhouetted against the light. One was clearly Malone, his gestures big and boisterous. The other was Mark. The two men were laughing, sharing a drink. It was a casual meeting, a social call between allies. The next day, Jake went back to the diner, the same one where Mark had dismissed him. He waited and waited. When Mark finally came in, Jake was already sitting in the booth, 2 coffees on the table. He didn't say a word. He just pointed at the seat across from him. Mark sighed, the weariness in his face more pronounced than before. He sat down and stared into his coffee cup.
I told you, Jake, leave it alone. I saw you last night,
Jake said, his voice quiet but firm.
You were with Malone. Why?
Mark finally looked up, and for the first time, Jake saw the shame in his eyes. It was a brief, painful flash of regret before the wall came back up.
He's a client. I do private security work on the side. It's nothing. It's not nothing, Mark,
Jake said, pushing a file across the table. Inside were the documents Jake had gathered. In Mark's eyes, the wall finally crumbled. I know, Jake, I know. I wake up every night thinking about it. They told me it was a controlled burn, that no one would get hurt. They said Mike was supposed to be on another floor. They didn't plan for him to be there. It was a mistake. It was a mistake of your own making, Mark, Jake said, pushing his chair back. You made a choice, and you chose them over me. You chose money over a friend, and you chose to let Mike die for your own selfish reasons. He stood up, leaving the file on the table. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to say. The person he had once considered a brother was a stranger, an accomplice in the crime that had ruined him. The truth was colder than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a corporate conspiracy. It was a betrayal from the inside, from the very person who was supposed to have his back. The pain was unbearable, but in it, Jake found a new, colder resolve. He was no longer just seeking justice. He was seeking revenge. And he would get it, no matter the cost. Confrontation and the crushing blow. Jake left the diner a different man. The conversation with Mark had peeled back a layer of protection he didn't even know he had. It was one thing to be betrayed by a stranger, but to have a friend admit to his complicity, to reveal the casualness of his betrayal, was a kind of pain no fire could ever inflict. It was a cold, quiet agony. But with that pain came a new resolve, sharper than a razor's edge. He had a new target now, not just the powerful men, but the weak link, the man who had traded his honor for a promise. The next morning, Jake was waiting for Mark outside his apartment complex. The detective looked haggard, his face pale and his eyes shadowed. He had barely slept. The weight of what he'd confessed hung over him like a shroud. "You're not going to get me fired, Jake," Mark said, his voice a low hiss. "I won't let you." "I'm not here to get you fired," Jake replied, his voice calm, even. "I'm here for something else." Voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'll tell her everything. I'll tell her you've been working with the men who let Mike die. I'll tell her you chose a bonus check over your own conscience. And I'll tell her what kind of man you really are." Mark's face went white. The thought of his wife, the one person he still had, learning the truth was the one thing he couldn't bear. He was trapped. He looked at Jake, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. "You're a damn ghost, Jake. You've got nothing to lose." "That's right," Jake said, a cold smile touching his lips. "And you have everything. So what's it going to be?" The confrontation was brutal and quiet. A silent war waged on a quiet street. Mark finally broke. His shoulder slumped and he hung his head in defeat. He began to talk, telling Jake about the coded text messages, the secret meetings, the promises of promotion and wealth. He revealed how Malone and Hayes had used him to bury the real cause of the fire and how they'd planted fake evidence to incriminate Jake. As the information spilled out, Jake's hands tightened into fists. The rage he had suppressed for months came boiling to the surface. He learned that Mike's death wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated risk. They knew Mike was a liability, and they'd made sure the fire was so intense that any evidence of arson would be destroyed. They didn't care about the lives they were playing with. It was all a numbers game to them. Jake had his confirmation, the missing pieces of his puzzle. The evidence was all there, a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to Malone and Hayes. He stood up, leaving Mark alone on the sidewalk. There was no victory, no sense of satisfaction, just a cold, hard truth that had solidified his resolve. He had to go it alone, but now he had all the ammunition he needed. The game was no longer about proving his innocence. It was about destroying theirs. The accidental break and the reckless plan. Jake walked away from Mark, the bitter truth a poison in his veins. He had the information, but it was just words. He needed proof. Gardening club meeting. The caption mentioned her as the club's new president, a generous and kind person who had been a great addition to the community. Her name was Carol Miller. Jake felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same name from the cryptic forum post. She hadn't disappeared. She had moved. She was right here in the city, just in a different neighborhood, living under a new name. He had been looking for a ghost, and he had found a real person, a potential ally. He found the address of the community center where the gardening club met. He went there immediately, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. He found Carol in the middle of a meeting, her face weary but her eyes sharp. She was a frail-looking woman, but there was a quiet strength about her. After the meeting, he approached her. He didn't use his real name. "I'm looking for a friend," he said, his voice low. "His name is Frank Miller. I believe you knew him." Carol's face went white. Her eyes, filled with sadness, met his. "I don't know anyone named Frank," she said, her voice trembling. She began to walk away. Jake knew he had one shot. "He was a building inspector," he said, his words a desperate plea. "He worked on the Liberty Tower fire." She stopped dead in her tracks. She turned around, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I was the fire captain," Jake said, dropping the pretense. "They blamed me for it. They made me lose everything. I know your husband knew something. He saw something." Tears welled in her eyes. "You have to go," she whispered, looking around nervously. "They'll hurt us. They'll know I've been talking." "They've already hurt you," Jake insisted. "They made your husband disappear. I'm not with the police. I'm just like you. I lost everything because of them. I can help you, but you have to trust me." She looked at him, at his tired eyes and the exhaustion etched on his face. Make sure the world saw the truth so they could never bury it again. He had to create a public spectacle, a final confrontation where there would be no escape for the men who had ruined his life. He had his evidence, but now he needed a plan to use it. A very dangerous, very public plan. Jake held the hard drive in his hand, its cool plastic a tangible weight of truth and vengeance. He couldn't just drop it in a mailbox or hand it to a lawyer. Malone and Hayes would bury it, just like they'd buried Frank Miller and Jake's reputation. He needed a public stage, a moment so explosive that they couldn't possibly contain the fallout. He had to light a fire of his own, not with gasoline and matches, but with facts and fury. He knew just the person to help him. A local investigative journalist named Sarah Vance, a sharp, tenacious reporter known for taking on corruption and not backing down. She had been one of the few who had questioned the official fire report from the start, writing articles about the unanswered questions and missing pieces. She was a lone wolf, and Jake knew she would understand. He met her in a secluded corner of a public park, a place where prying eyes would be less likely to notice them. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I have proof," he said, handing her the hard drive. "Proof that the Liberty Tower fire was arson, and that the men who profited from it are the ones who framed me." Vance looked at him, her skepticism warring with a journalist's instinct for a major scoop. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I'm the guy who was blamed for the fire," he said, looking her dead in the eye. "My name is Jake Riley." She stared at him, recognition dawning in her eyes. "The fire captain," she whispered. "Everyone says you're a mess, that you're just some crazy conspiracy theorist." "I am a ghost," he corrected her, "and this is the ghost's truth." She took the hard drive, her fingers brushing his. "What's on it?" "Everything," he said, a grim smile on his face. For the grand unveiling of the new tower, a triumphant return for their project. They looked confident, untouchable. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. Vance began her live segment, a standard report on the tower's rebirth. But then she held up the hard drive. "Tonight," she said, her voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere, "we're not just here to celebrate. We're here to talk about the fire that made it all possible." Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Jake, dressed in a simple black jacket, his face illuminated by the bright TV lights. The crowd gasped. The cameras swiveled. Malone and Hayes, standing on the dais, froze, their faces turning to ashen masks of disbelief and rage. "Jake Riley," Vance announced, her voice resonating with power. "The man the city blamed for the fire. But tonight, he's going to tell us who really said it." Jake stood tall, his gaze fixed on Malone and Hayes. He wasn't a hero, but he was no longer a victim. He was a man with nothing to lose, armed with the truth, and he was ready to watch the world burn. The cameras were rolling, and the truth was finally about to be set free. The confession and the unraveling. The camera lights were blinding, a stark, unforgiving interrogation. The air, once filled with the murmur of a celebratory crowd, was now charged with a tense, electric silence. Jake stood before the cameras, a ghost finally stepping into the light. He held a microphone, but his voice was a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. He didn't start with accusations. He started with the truth of his experience, recounting the horrifying moments inside Liberty Tower. The feel of the heat, the sound of the collapsing beams, and the agonizing sight of his friend Mike being crushed. "They said it was my fault," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "They said I made a mistake." He then held up the hard drive. "But they were wrong. This contains the truth." He looked straight into the camera, his gaze unwavering. The Liberty Tower fire was not an accident. It was a turn to see a man pushing through the crowd. It was Mark Collins, the detective. He was no longer a polished cop. He was a broken man, his face a mess of tears and a fresh brewed courage. He had been watching the broadcast from his car, unable to look away. He had seen the terror on Malone's and Hayes' faces and knew this was his last chance at redemption. He ran to Jake, grabbing the microphone from him. "I'm a detective with the city's police force," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "And I can confirm Jake's story. Malone and Hayes planned the whole thing. They paid me to look the other way, to cover up the evidence. They promised me a promotion. They promised me everything. They monsters. They killed Mike. They planned to kill him." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The camera zoomed in on Mark, his confession a cascade of details, the coded texts, the secret meetings, the promises, the lie they had told him about Mike's location. Malone and Hayes' carefully constructed world of lies crumbled in a matter of minutes. Hayes, the master of public relations, lost his composure. He tried to grab the microphone from Mark, screaming, "You're a traitor! A liar!" The scene devolved into chaos. The news footage was raw, unfiltered, and devastating. Malone and Hayes, caught in the open, were exposed for the criminals they were. The public had seen their reaction, their rage, their fear. They had seen the truth come to light. As sirens wailed in the distance, Jake stood back, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. He had his justice. The city's heroes were no longer the rich developers or the slick politicians. They were the men who fought the fire, and the one who had been brave enough to confess. The war was over. He had won. But the victory felt hollow. He was still alone, and the price of his revenge was a wound that would never fully heal. The sirens of the police cruisers screamed, and the cameras flashed like a sudden violent thunderstorm. Malone and Hayes, their faces twisted with disbelief and defeat, were cuffed and led away. Mark, his confession still ringing in the air,
was also taken into custody, a weary and broken man who had finally chosen the right path. The city watched in stunned silence, wind whipping around him. And finally, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he spoke to his friend. "I did it, Mike," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I got them. They're going to pay for what they did, for what they took from us." He told Mike about the blueprints, the hard drive, and the television broadcast. He told him about Mark's confession, a confession that had cost him his freedom, but had finally given Mike justice. He told him everything. But as he spoke, the emptiness inside him didn't fade. The rage was gone, replaced by a profound and heavy sadness. The revenge was a hollow victory. It hadn't brought Mike back. It hadn't restored his family. After a while, he drove to the small apartment complex where Sarah and Lily were now living. He stood outside for a long time, watching the lit windows, a stranger looking in on his old life. He saw Lily laughing, her small face glowing with a joy he hadn't seen in months. Sarah was with her, a small, fragile smile on her face. The truth had set them free from the lies that had poisoned their lives. They were safe. They were happy. But he wasn't a part of it anymore. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't have to. The news of his vindication was all over the city. She would know. She would know he was innocent. But innocence couldn't rebuild a broken trust. It couldn't bring back the years they had lost. The man who had walked away from the TV cameras was a hero, a legend. But the man standing outside that apartment was just Jake, a man who had lost everything and gained nothing but a bitter truth. He turned and walked away, a ghost returning to the shadows. He had won the war, but he had lost himself in the process. His story was over, but a new, quieter chapter had just begun. A life built on the ashes of his past. A lonely and solemn peace found in a world that would never be the same again.